Afternoon, good morning. We can go ahead and start with our next presentation. We'd like you to join us in welcoming Dr. Rosalind Hunter Anderson and Ms. Joanne Eakin and their presentation on ancient DNA from Guam and Saipan confirms biological and cultural continuities for more than 2,500 years. Dr. Rosalind Hunter Anderson came to Micronesia in 1980 to study Yapi settlement patterns from an ethno-archaeological perspective. This field experience that led to an enduring interest in the prehistory and ethnology of the region. At the University of Guam, Hunter Anderson pursued field studies on freshwater customs and organized the first Micronesian Archaeology Conference in 1987. The proceedings were published in 1990 as a special issue of the journal Micronesia. Under an NSF fellowship at UC Irvine in 1989, she completed an archival study of traditional Micronesian farming systems and produced a documentary film about women in science. In 1990, she joined Guam archaeologists Darlene Moore, Judy Amsbury, and Eleanor Wells to form Micronesian Archaeological Research Services, conducting a variety of archaeological projects focused on the island archaeology, or focused on the Marianas during the 1990s and early 2000s. Hunter Anderson also produced a weekly public radio show, Island Archaeology, and continued to present her work locally, internationally, and in scholarly journals. Her disciplinary study of ancient Chamorro burial populations and Micronesian population history with osteologist Joanne Eakin and geneticist David Reich from the Harvard Medical School and Ron Pinhasi from the University of Vienna. Hunter Anderson and husband Yigal Zan moved to New Mexico in 2006, where she continues to work on a book that reframes Micronesian archaeology as a collaborative science. Ms. Joanne Eakin, M.A., is an archaeologist and osteologist who has worked with the state and federal agencies, academic institutions, and cultural resource management firms in the U.S. Southwest and Pacific region. Ms. Eakin began conducting bioarchaeological research in the Western Pacific in 1991. Her work includes skeletal inventories and analyses of large populations on Guam and the CNMI, recovery of World War II Japanese and American remains from the Battle of Tarawa in Kiribati and the U.S. invasion of Saipan, and DNA research into early population history of Micronesia. While conducting the initial skeletal assessments at the Guam Natan Beach site in 2007, Ms. Eakin documented the mortuary and physical variations between the Lati and late Unai populations. So join me in welcoming them and beginning their presentation.
Testing. Good, huh? Okay.
Start the slides first.
Looks
Yeah.
good.
Okay. Okay. I'm off.
It's up and running. Yeah.
Next slide. Next slide. Go.
Okay. Half a day, everybody. Glad to be here. And thank you for coming. Our research into ancient Chamorro origins began in 2006 with a mystery, an archaeological puzzle. This puzzle appeared during excavations at the Natan Beach site in Tumon, Guam. More than 16 years later, we have a surprising solution. My colleague Joanne Eakin and I are part of a team of archaeologists, osteologists, Chamorro language experts, and geneticists, collaborating on studies about population origins, movements, and relationships across the Western Pacific. Ancient DNA from late Unai and Lati individuals formed the genetic basis of our study, which we have interpreted through the lens of anthropological archaeology. Here we present the results of that joint effort inspired by the unique archaeological context of a coastal village occupied 2,800 years ago by the late Unai people, Guam's first permanent settlers, and later during the Latte period. We conclude the presentation with a video message from our local collaborator, Miss Alyssa M.C. Titano, who unfortunately couldn't be here in person. A recent UOG graduate in biology, Miss Titano will tell about her experiences during this project as a young scientist and as a Chamorro woman.
Next slide, please.
First, a very brief history of human presence in the Western Pacific region. Ancient people colonized near Oceania about 47,000 years ago. They were present for tens of thousands of years in New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Solomon Islands. During that time, the remote islands of the Pacific, including the Marianas, were uninhabited. About 4,000 years ago, the sea level in the tropical Western Pacific was declining from its mid-Holocene high stand. On the high islands of Micronesia, shorelines were changing.
Next, please.
In the Mariana Islands, traces of activities of mobile marine foragers provide evidence for the first human presence, not only in the Marianas, but in all of remote Oceania at around 3,500 to 3,000 years ago. Their occasional excursions into the Mariana Archipelago continued for about 1,000 years as sea levels continued to decline. Fewer than 10 of their campsites are known from Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Saipan. The oldest of these sites has been dated to about 3,500 years ago. And unfortunately for our search for Chamorro origins, they contain no human burials. We think this is because the early people were only occasional visitors from island Southeast Asia, their homelands.
Next, please.
By the onset of the Southeast Asian Iron Age around 2,500 years ago, people had permanently occupied the southern Marianas coast. This time period, known archaeologically in the Marianas as the Late Unai, was well represented by artifacts, but aside for some isolated and fragmentary human bones, no burials had been found. About 900 years passed before settlement patterns changed from exclusively coastal to expansion into inland areas. This was the Hudzong period. By 1,200 years ago, a fishing and farming system was in place. The Latte period had begun. It included coastal and inland residential and farming locales, monumental stone architecture, and betel nut and upland rice cultivation. Latte structures were built as far north as Pagan, showing a geographic expansion not seen during previous periods.
Next.
Many of you are familiar with the terms Latte and pre-Latte. The new chronology, including Chamorro terms, derives from 5 decades of scholarly research into the Marianas archaeological record. On the screen is the breakdown of the Marianas archaeological chronology with a finer partitioning of the pre-Lati period. We consulted Chamorro language experts, Drs. Sauder and Palomo, who provided an explanation for how they describe the different eras. For the early and middle Unai periods, when there were no permanent settlements, their description means, quote, the ocean voyagers came and went, unquote. The Chamorro description for the late Unai is, quote, the ocean voyagers stayed and established their homeland. The language experts further describe the Hutzong period as a time when people moved inland to utilize different resources. The Lati period is the time when the people became Lati builders.
In 2006, excavations began at a hotel renovation project at Natan Beach on Guam. The work resulted in the recovery and analysis of 370 sets of human skeletal remains. 2 temporally and culturally distinct groups were recognized at Natan: those who lived during the Lati period from around 1200 years ago, and an earlier population who lived during the middle to late Unai periods from as early as 2800 years ago. Now remember that we mentioned earlier that no complete Unai burials had ever been recovered. The archaeologists at Natan recovered 155. Slide, please. The late Unai burials at Natan were the first of their kind to be excavated. They contrasted with the later Lati populations in morphology, pathology, and mortuary practices. Late Unai graves were deep in white sand. They were, they were below the darker, culturally enriched soils of the Lati period. The late Unai burials exhibited a consistency in burial position relative to Lati period interments. 96% were in fully extended supine position, that is, on their backs, as opposed to 56% of the Lati period burials, which were also flexed or bundled or face down or commingled with other people. Lati burials often show signs of post-mortem disturbance. It's not unusual for Lati skeletal elements to have been removed post-burial. No such behaviors were seen in the late Unai assemblage. Next. Elaborate treatment of the deceased is generally lacking at Lati period graves, and the grave goods are few and simple. Late Unai burials had a larger quantity and greater variety of grave goods compared to the Lati burials. Some of the late Unai burials included deposits of red and yellow ochre. The late Unai burial on the left includes an Anadara ring bead necklace and a large pinctada shell. On the right is a late Unai infant with more than 100 shell beads and a shell bracelet on each arm. Grave goods in child burials are extremely uncommon in the Lati period. Next. Here are some of the hundreds of shell ornaments that were recovered from late Unai burials. Judy Amesbury here on Guam has shared so much about this collection of ornaments, and I'm sure many people are already familiar with the subject. And I saw the display as well this morning in the lobby of the museum. Next. There were also beautifully made basalt tools and shell adzes, shell fish hooks, and gorges buried with the late Unai people. Next. There are significant differences in the size and dimensions of cranial bones, postcranial bones, and dentition. The late Unai population was more gracile than the Lati population. Larger, more robust bones were
I know. That's a
observed among the Laddie people. Other differences include the incidence and types of dental wear and changes in the location of activity-related degenerative joint disease. These traits suggest that the Late Unai people engaged in different activities compared to the Laddie people. Diseases differed between the two populations. In particular, treponemal infection, yaws, was not identified in the Late Unai population at all, but was common during the Laddie period. Beetle nut staining in adults was ubiquitous during the Laddie period. And here's an example on the right. Beetle nut staining was essentially absent during Late Unai, as you can see on the left. Slide. The Late Unai were the first people to create permanent settlements and bury their dead in the Marianas. Despite their physical and cultural differences, were the Late Unai people ancestors of the Laddie people? Were they related to modern-day Chamorros? When we began this work, the prevailing settlement scenario was that these early people were migrant farmers from the northern Philippines who sailed across the open ocean to the Marianas. The argument for a Philippine origin was based to a great extent on similar pottery types and linguistics. However, the currents and the winds are not favorable for travel to Guam from the Philippines. Sailing simulations favor travel from island Southeast Asia. Nevertheless, the migration model of colonists leaving the Philippines to seek new lands had been perpetuated for decades. But if they didn't come from the Philippines, where did these early visitors to the Marianas come from? Could ancient DNA analysis help answer these questions? So with the support of the Guam Historic Preservation Officer, Ms. Linda B. Eakin, we applied to the Guam Preservation Trust to fund a pilot project. The first phase of the project would determine if any DNA had survived the hot, humid burial environment. For the feasibility study, we sampled dentition because at that time, long bones and teeth were thought to be the best skeletal elements for DNA recovery because of their strength and density. We submitted the dentition to colleagues at the University of Huddersfield in England. They detected highly deteriorated DNA in some of the teeth, but the results were disappointing. Now we hear about DNA being extracted from all sorts of ancient creatures, much older than our samples. We can look at Neanderthal DNA or Mastodon DNA, but those samples are from drier and often much cooler conditions. Ancient DNA can be extremely fragmentary and seriously degraded under adverse burial conditions, and the Natan skeletons were fragile after millennia of burial in a warm, wet environment, and the DNA preservation was very poor. Next, please. Next slide, please. Our initial effort to find ancient DNA from teeth was not a success, but a benefit of the pilot project was dietary information from stable isotopes in tooth enamel. This was a small sample, and a wider range of values exists across other Marianas populations. The Late Unai diet comprised a smaller proportion of marine foods and a larger proportion of land foods than marine foragers. That land foods were important during the Late Unai is supported by residue of taro, bananas, and breadfruit found at other Tumon sites from this time period. Slide, please.
While our first attempts to recover DNA were not successful, by 2018, the technology had advanced significantly, and we tried again, this time using the petrous portion of the temporal bone. The petrous is a bone near the base of the skull, which houses the middle and inner ear. The cochlea in the inner ear is the hardest bone in the body, and it remains strong and dense even under harsh, wet burial conditions. Dr. Ron Pinhazi now at the University of Vienna, determined that the cochlea is a reliable DNA source, and he developed a technique that allows for the recovery of DNA from fragile samples such as those found at Natan. Our new research partners were Ron Pinhazi, Dr. David Reich, and Yue Chen Liu from Harvard Medical School, whom some of you may have heard this morning. Dr. Olivia Sharonnet from the Pinhazi lab assisted us in selecting the samples at the Guam Museum. At the Pinhazi lab in Vienna, a small portion of the cochlea was powdered and brought into a specialized clean lab where potential contamination was carefully controlled for. The cochlea powder was chemically processed to purify the sample. The samples were then sent to the Reich lab at Harvard, where the DNA fragments were decoded and transformed into sequence data. This step can be complicated when the DNA fragments are so degraded and might be mixed with various contaminants, such as bacteria from the soil in which the individual had been buried, or modern contamination from the excavators. Dr. Liu performed highly detailed and complex analyses of the data using various bioinformatic and statistical methods, as you saw earlier today. Samples that yielded analyzable DNA were also radiocarbon dated, so we have solid dates and confirmation on our assumptions about the age of these burials. Slide, please. Oh, I just lost my shoot. I don't know. Okay, let's see. I'll find it. All right. Well, I lost a little piece of my oration here. We now had, this is the situation, we now had late Unai data from Natan, but we still needed to study ancient DNA from the Lati period to determine if there is biological continuity between the two populations. Enter Dr. Miguel Villar, known to some of you for his genetic studies with modern Chamorros. He encouraged us to apply for a National Geographic Society Explorer grant to support the collection of the Lati period DNA samples from Natan, and thus enable a comparative study of the two populations. In 2020, we collected petrous samples from the Natan Lati skeletal collection, and with additional support from the Reich lab, we also collected Lati period samples from Saipan. In all, we and others collected ancient DNA samples from Guam, Saipan, and Ponape, and we compared them with modern DNA samples from Guam, Palau, Chuuk, and Ponape. Most of the prehistoric samples, though, came from Guam and Saipan. In 2021, our research team, including Ms. Taitano, traveled to Dr. Reich's labs at Harvard to observe just how the ancient DNA samples were processed and analyzed. A highlight of that visit was to sit with Dr. Reich and others on the project to discuss the findings within the context of Marianas archaeology. The results. The late Unai burials were confirmed to be the earliest known burials in the Marianas. Radiocarbon dates for the Unai burials we analyzed range from 2,800 to 2,200 years ago. That's the max and min of that late Unai group. This image shows the late Unai and Lati period burials at Natan. The Unai are blue and the Lati are in red. Slide, please. More than 90% of the late Unai mtDNA, which is the maternally inherited DNA, belongs to the most common lineage that is present in modern Chamorro. The E2 lineage originated during the Holocene, between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, in eastern Indonesia, most likely Sulawesi. Our geneticist partners infer that the unusual homogeneity in the late Unai mtDNA lineages at Natan is evidence that Chamorros descend from a small founding population, perhaps a few dozen people. However, us being aware of the vulnerability of human populations in this region of frequent typhoons and droughts, we doubt that such a small founding population could have survived and thrived without occasional immigrants, likely relatives who had the same DNA profiles as the original Natan settlers. Another important inference from the homogeneous mtDNA among the late Unai people is that the data indicate the practice of matrilocality. Matrilocality, it's a marriage practice in which the wife stays in her natal home, family, and the husband comes in and lives with her and her family. That's matrilocality. And throughout the world and in the Pacific Islands, matrilocal marriage and matrilineal inheritance of family assets often are practiced together. Okay. By the Lati period, all the islands of Micronesia, including the raised coral islands and atolls of the Central Carolines, also the Marshalls and Kiribati, had been occupied by seagoing peoples. Our study detected more DNA lineages among the Lati individuals at Natan. These new Lati period lineages reflect ties with Melanesia and eastern Indonesia. A maternally inherited lineage that is common in ancient Polynesians, the B4A1A1, appears in Lati individuals at Natan. The increased genetic variation at Natan by the Lati period appear to relate to the later migratory streams within and into Micronesia as outlined by Dr. Liu this morning. Slide, please. Whole genome analysis. Whole genome analysis yields accurate estimates of family relationships up to third-degree relatives. Analysis of 28 of our late Unai individuals identified 4 families, each with 2 members, including 1 pair with a first-degree relationship and 3 pairs with second- or third-degree relationships. Among 75 Natan Lati individuals, whole genome analysis identified 7 families with between 2 and 30 family members in each. We found 3 pairs of individuals with mother-daughter relationships, 3 individuals that had a father-son relationship, 4 pairs were siblings, and 3 pairs had a first-degree relationship. In addition, 82 pairs of Lati individuals had a second- or third-degree relationship, uncles, aunts, cousins. Each burial, now this is what was really how the genetics went with the archaeology. Each burial's location had been plotted during excavation, and the whole genome analysis showed that closely related individuals were often buried next to each other or nearby in genetically defined family groups. Here are plots of the 7 Lati families with their relationships. Family B had the most members interred at Natan and may have been one of the oldest families at the site. And now for something completely different. We will now hear from our colleague, Miss Alyssa M.C. Titano.
Next, please.
Video, please. There she is.
Hafaday, my name is Alyssa Titano. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology from the University of Guam, and I'm the local collaborator of this research team. I'll be breaking up this presentation into 3 parts. First, the Harvard lab visit, then my perspective of the study as a scientist, then my personal perspective as a Chamorro woman. My purpose as the local collaborator is to help educate the community of the study findings as an Indigenous scientist. I, along with Dr. Hunter Anderson, Ms. Eakin, and my father traveled to Boston to visit Dr. David Reich's lab at Harvard Medical School. This is where the analytical procedures were conducted for the ancient DNA. In this photo, we are discussing the research findings at the Museum of Comparative Zoology building. After meeting the experts, Dr. Yue Chen Liu and Dr. David Reich, I got the impression that the ancient Chamorro DNA was in good hands, based on how knowledgeable they were on the DNA analysis and how passionate they were about the study. On the far left is Dr. Yue Chen Liu, a postdoc under Dr. Reich and the first author of this study. To the right of Ms. Eakin is Dr. Jacob Sadig, a postdoc under Dr. Reich as well. He has helped prepare the grant application to the National Geographic Society and arranged our lab visit at Harvard. To the right of him is Dr. David Reich, a geneticist and principal investigator of the David Reich Lab of Harvard University. Dr. Miguel Villar, on the far right, is a geneticist who studies modern Chamorro DNA and is a co-author of this study. Although my dad came as a proud father, they invited him to sit at the table with us and allowed him to share his thoughts on how their research was perceived by an Indigenous Chamorro. It was a surreal moment for my dad and I, interacting with the professionals such as Dr. Liu and Dr. Reich. There's been much debate on where Chamorros originated from and their movements. Much of the evidence is mainly from linguistic markers and archaeological findings, such as Marianas redware, but not much from a genetic standpoint. Scholars have theorized that Chamorros came from the Philippines, based on the Chamorro language being grouped in the Austronesian language family, where Tagalog, for example, is grouped as well. An example of these similarities are shown in the word coconut, where in Chamorro, coconut is nizuk, and in Tagalog, coconut is nyug. The theory that Chamorros are from the Philippines, specifically the northern Philippines, would be correct if all Austronesian languages were derived from Taiwan, being the parent language, and Chamorro being the daughter language. However, this theory was rejected due to archaeological findings showing that early settlers were marine foragers rather than agriculturalists from the northern Philippines. Another example is pottery. Although there is no evidence that confirms the link between pottery from the Philippines and pottery from the Marianas, it is often an example of how Chamorros are potentially from the Philippines. This is due to their similar designs and the time of their production, which is around 3,500 years ago. However, recent microscopic examination of the Marianas redware and pottery from the Philippines showed that the production processes were completely different. So that poses the question, where are we from? Where did Chamorros come from? Along with recent archaeological evidence, genetic evidence is also straying away from the theory that Chamorros are from the Philippines. We found that ancient Chamorros are likely from island Southeast Asia, having no New Guinea or Philippine ancestry. This study also included Central Micronesian islanders such as Pohnpeians and Chukis for comparison. It was concluded that they have Northern New Guinea ancestry. Because of genetics, we can confirm that ancient Chamorros had a matrilocal society. After a Chamorro man and woman were married, the women stayed in their family home while their newlywed husband would be welcomed into the woman's home. We know this because of the strong homogeneity of haplogroup E2A. In contrast, Palau and Central Micronesia show evidence of a patrilocal society. Personally, I have struggled with the Chamorro identity for as long as I could remember. Growing up, I was confused as to what is truly Chamorro and what we as a people have acculturated. One example is counting. In Chamorro class, I was taught uno, dos, tres, cuatro for the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. But later I found out that was Spanish, and real Chamorro counting was Hatsa, Huga, Tulu, Fatfat. Due to the lack of documentation, we Chamorros relied solely on oral tradition to learn our customs and history. This particular study excites me because of what we could learn and now confirm from genetics about our cultural practices as Chamorros and Micronesians. DNA studies of ancient Chamorros simply add another clue to the mystery of our origins. Most written documents about our past are from a westernized perspective, which usually favors the author's agenda and beliefs. With DNA, there is no historiography. DNA provides evidence that eliminates bias. Genetic studies specifically provide ancient Chamorros a voice and tells the story of our movements and practices as a people. I, along with my dad, whom I shared this experience with, are very thankful that there is research like this that sheds light on our origins. These genetic discoveries are helping to correct long-standing myths of our origins. Thank you, and Dankulu Nasizuos Maasi.
There's more. There's
My name
more.
is- Hapaday. My name is Alyssa Taitino.
No, next
I
slide.
have a bachelor's.
There we go.
Well, that was a good ending. We could have ended.
Yeah, we could have just, but no,
But-
there's more. There's more. Not much more. A little bit more.
To summarize,
Yeah.
the analyses showed that the lineage of both the late Unai and Latte period groups originated during the Holocene, 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, in eastern Indonesia, most likely Sulawesi. The late Unai at Natan are the earliest known burials in the Marianas. The late Unai and Latte period DNA showed no direct prehistoric connections to the Philippines. Despite differences in appearance and custom, the late Unai and Latte people of Natan Beach shared the same maternally inherited lineages, proof of remarkable genetic continuity across 2,500 years into the present day. The study showed that the ancestors of the Chamorro people were here from the beginning of permanent settlement.
In conclusion, slide 25. Slide. Okay. In conclusion, our comparative study of two burial populations who lived at the Natan Beach site at very different times in the past has broken new ground, if you will pardon the pun. Not only did highly advanced ancient DNA research technology help solve the mystery of Natan Beach, many other possibilities for learning about the remote human past were revealed during the project. We learned that genetic continuity does not always equal cultural continuity, but in some cases it does. We also learned that biological characteristics of a population can change over time as they adjust to changing environmental and social conditions. Siduus Masi for allowing us to uncover a small part of the story of Chamorro biological and cultural heritage. It's a story of innovation, resilience, and adherence to traditions. And we want to give a special thanks to Mr. Joe Kinata, who may not here at the moment, who has been with us from the beginning. The end. Oh, one more. Oh, so one more. Sorry. Uh-oh, there's another one.
You have to go one
One more. Okay, yeah, of course.
One more. Next slide.
Yeah,
Our
that's right.
acknowledgements.
Yes.
You want-
I can't read that.
Okay.
No, it's too small.
Okay, we appreciate all the support from David Reich, Ron Pinhasi, National Geographic, Guam Preservation Trust, University of Huddersfield, Oxford, and Stanley Ambrose at University of Illinois. And we had so much support here in Guam and on Saipan. And we want to thank everybody, and we hope to continue this work.
So,
Now we're done.
that's the real end. Okay.
Okay, so we do have a few minutes for some questions and answers. If anyone has a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and start us off.
Here we go.
Thank you to both of you for your presentation today. This is a fascinating subject. So, does your work contrast against Dr. Yue Chen Liu's findings? I thought I heard him say that there were 2 Southeast Asian origins, or am I hearing that wrong?
Yes, he has it much more finely partitioned than we are doing here. We were, for this particular study, it's a part of the big one, and this is the National Geographic part of it. They funded the comparative study, so we were not meshing, but not necessarily contrasting with Dr. Liu's conclusions. He's just got it much more finely partitioned because he's got a lot more data, a lot of modern data to compare, and all kinds of analyses that can get the inferences back, way back to even before we had any burials here. So our study, our paper is just related to the comparison of the two, but I don't see any contrast with his work and ours. Our work is really derived from all of the analysis that he has done, but we've tried to put it into more of a archaeological context that shows why we even wanted to do this work. We're not geneticists after all, but we need genetics as a tool for archaeology.
We
Thank-
expect to have the full paper that addresses the genetic study with an archaeological background incorporated into the paper is due to be out in Science anytime now. So you can read that and it'll be a little more clear. We did have some, I don't know, the presentation was a little awkward to hear earlier.
Oh yeah, I could hardly hear
Yeah,
it
so-
myself, understand anyway.
We're all in the same team.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we actually have time for one more question.
Hi, Hafaday. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really great, amazing. I loved how you included a local collaborator from Yoji. Woo. I actually had a question about the findings and how it was exciting to hear you contrast it with, or to reinforce it with cultural differences between the late Unai and the Ladi period.
Yeah.
And I noticed you mentioned that the late Unai period, their diet, due to the DNA being heavily degraded, you were able to see that their diet was more terrestrial based. And then I think that there was a mention of needing to rely more so on terrestrial based diets for the late Unai period.
Yes.
But why do you think there were differences between I'm trying to see where the cultural aspect of it connects to the genetic aspect, because you notice differences in the graves, in the markings, the way the burials were, and the way the bodies were laid out. But was there something else that you found that was very exciting within that nexus of culture, DNA, and genetics, and archaeology, sorry? Was there something very exciting there that you personally found?
I thought what you just listed, I thought all those things were very exciting, that there were such differences, that at the time, when this started, when our work together started, and when I first saw the burials in the ground, I thought they were different people. I thought they had come from an entirely different place. And so, it was very clear that there were the physical differences and the differences in burial tradition. And so we were so delighted to find that they were all the same people from the very beginning. They changed once they settled here. They changed, their foods changed, even their appearance changed because food changes you, activities change you, and then your culture changes. But they were the same from the very beginning.
It's the continuity was proved by this study. And the cultural continuity as well with the matrilocality, that was holding through too. Inferences from the DNA. And so, we don't have an ethnography of Chamorro at European contact. We know we don't have that, but we have the DNA as an independent source of that information. So, that's, yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. I just want to go back to when you were showing the two skulls of the Unai and the Lati period, and you mentioned something about the Pugwa stains. However, on your DNA and your findings and stuff, can you elaborate a little bit more on the teeth? Because I believe the Chamorros of the Lati period had tattoo engravements
incising,
and almost every
Mm-hmm.
tooth in their mouth.
Yeah.
And it would have been nice if we saw something like that, and you could have explained what the findings were in relation to those.
That's true. That's fairly common to see during the Lati period is the incised teeth. I didn't list all of the differences for this presentation. I could.
But we can't tie DNA to external things like that.
Okay.
It's custom.
Right.
It's a custom that was not practiced in the late Unai. The teeth are perfectly white. Mm-hmm. There's no decoration or any modification, I should say. So, they were just this.
I was just wondering, what did they actually use to make those engraving within every tooth of the mouth?
I don't know, but it must have hurt. I think.
Yes. Okay.
Well, tattoos hurt too. It's part of the thing. You sacrifice.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't know that. About the ancient Chamorros had engravings in their mouth.
Yeah, I'm sure those were symbolic. Meanings. They had meanings to those designs, just like in pottery you have symbolic meanings too.
Right. Because exactly. I wanted to know what they were trying to tell us.
I know. Still listening, yeah.
Right.
I know. Okay, that's it. Okay.
I would like to know how we were so fortunate to have you find the Natan Beach site. How did that come about, and what do we need to learn from this in terms of preserving, I don't know, everywhere on Guam?
Talk about the renovation. The building of the hotel.
I think that site was first documented by Mars in the 80s. Dave DeFont excavated it initially during the hotel renovation in the early 2000s. And, archaeologists benefit in a way by the expansion of the resorts here, because we do get to see what's in the ground. But there is a trade-off there, because then the sites are destroyed. So, that's a matter of local decision-making. In my opinion, I'm always happy to see it, to have an opportunity to see what's there. But, the local people need to decide what's more important.
To preserve them or to rebury them without learning from them.
Or even to excavate. In other places, you just avoid
Avoid, of course,
sites.
yeah.
That's sort of hard to do on a beach resort area.
But I have to remind you that these data came from only one part of the Natan Beach site. The rest had been destroyed by the Okura Hotel in the 70s, and there was no historic preservation program in place to protect it. So we lost the local context of these burials. We really lost that because the hotel wiped out that part of the site. So all that was left was this unbuilt upon part that was about to be built upon by the renovation of the hotel. So we got a chance. And I must say that with the historic preservation officer at the time, she was I had to really convince her that this was so important to preserve these skeletons. She was going to rebury them right away. And I said, this is a unique group of individuals. We don't even know if they're Chamorro ancestors or not. She said, oh, okay, well, maybe they're not Chamorro, so we can take a look at them. Anyway, that was the kind of interaction that one has to do in a situation like this, where you have government control, you have public pressure, you have all these elements, and well, I think we were very privileged, and appreciative that we had the chance to do this work. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. You mentioned that there was yaws seen in the Lati population as compared with the more gracile Unai population, like Unai. What do you attribute to this deterioration of health if we have continuity of the population?
Well, the genetic study does show the different other streams of people coming in during Lati period. So you do have the same people from the Unai continue to live here, but then in Lati times you had more people coming in. So I think that it was brought in from somewhere, and that is something that I'm hoping to investigate closely, is looking at the disease patterns that we see. Okay. So I think it just came from somewhere else.
Yeah, that's kind of like a history.
Right. The other question I had to do with the proportion of terrestrial to marine resources being used. Yeah. Were you surprised that the late Unai people are showing such a large proportion of terrestrial?
Well, by this time they're established.
Yeah, they're growing food,
and
not just foraging, but actually growing food. So, yeah, it's a larger proportion of the diet.
Yeah, as opposed to being a marine forager diet, we still have this gap. There's still a big chunk of time from the initial, the campsites, the early Unai campsites, for like 1,000 years of people coming and going, and then boom, at Natan we get the permanent settlements with the burials. And that could be just a very good piece of luck that we found those.
Yeah.
And there could be others. They may not ever be found. So we have that gap of 1,000 years where people were eventually, towards the end, they stayed and transitioned to the farming way of life. Well, mixed life ways, farming and fishing.
Yeah. Well, the comparison that we mentioned, we don't detail it. The comparison of the stable isotopes from are late Unai people, the teeth, and marine foragers were the data from Palau from about that same time period, a little earlier. So they were definitely marine foragers in Palau at that time, and the diet, the isotopes show that in the Palauan teeth, and they're compared to the late Unai teeth. They're not the same proportions, and so that's where that comes from. It's comparing some Palauan marine forager individuals from about that time period, a little bit older, about 3,000 years old. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions, but still amazing questions and amazing answers. Before we do end, though, we would like to give a heartfelt on behalf of the Guam Preservation Trust to Ms. Eakin and Dr. Hunter Anderson. We have just a little token for you. And if you could just pose for a picture.
You want us to stand?
Yeah, you can show me the certificate. For this certificate.
Hold it up. Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you so much again. And also at this time, lunch is going to be served at the Guam Museum, so you can just head your way over there. Thank you.